Hey everybody, hopefully you're breaking out those bows, blowing off that dust, and shaking off that rust as hunting season quickly approaches. In today's video, we're going to be discussing light arrows versus heavy arrows. I'm sure a lot of you guys, like myself, are looking back at last year, looking at ways we can improve our setups, and arrows are definitely one of them that are always up for discussion. So in today's video, we're going to talk about the benefits of light arrows versus heavy arrows, what it means for kinetic energy and momentum while we're hunting, and then also we're going to cover something that nobody really talks about, which is time to target, which is another take on speed of a bow. So let's get into it. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, why should we listen to this guy? What makes him different than all the thousands of other videos out on YouTube? Well, my background is in mechanical engineering, and part of being a mechanical engineer is you study principles of physics and fluid dynamics for a number of years prior to becoming a degreed mechanical engineer. Now, what this means as far as hunting goes is I understand exactly what's happening to arrows while they're traveling through any type of a medium. In this case, we're talking specifically to air. So if you're interested in getting into the technical side of bow hunting, this is definitely the video you want to check out. And we're going to cover kinetic energy, momentum, and depth here. But before we get to the spreadsheet I have prepared for you guys, we got to go over a couple of things to make sure we're all on the same page. So let's start with bows. With bows nowadays, there's generally two types of specs we want to pay attention to. The first is bow speed, and the second one, which is becoming a more common marketing tool, is kinetic energy. So talking about bow speed a little bit, yes, that is very important because that'll tell you what your bow is able to shoot under a certain circumstance. And that certain circumstance is shooting a 350 grain arrow at 70 pounds with a 30-inch draw. Now, most of us don't shoot a 30-inch draw length, and most of us shoot more, a heavier arrow than 350 grains. So when I look at a bow, I don't put a lot of faith into the marketing bow speed. What I pay attention to is kinetic energy. And the reason why I'm looking at the kinetic energy value is because the kinetic energy value that bow is able to put out is not going to change based on the arrow weight. The reason why is the bow behaves exactly like a spring. And the way a spring works is the more you compress it, the more force it's able to be put out. That's the equivalent of having a longer draw length. So hypothetically, if you had a 5-pound weight and a 10-pound weight on the same spring and you compressed it to the same distance, regardless of which weight is on that spring, as long as it's compressed to the same distance, that spring is going to push out the same amount of force. Bows are no different, which is why I pay attention more to the kinetic energy value than the speed value. It's a concrete, definitive way of gauging how much force that bow is able to be putting out. Now, the thing with kinetic energy nowadays is most modern bows are shooting well above what's needed to break bone. And they say on the internet that about 55 foot-pounds of force is enough to break bone. So most bows are shooting anywhere from 80 to 100 pounds with the most maximum potential of the bow. The thing that we need to pay attention to is momentum. So momentum, if you think about it, is the force needed to continue to travel through a medium, whether that's air, whether that's a deer, where kinetic energy is that bone-breaking force. And like we said before, that's going to remain constant regardless of what arrow you shoot. So now that we've kind of got those definitions and expectations out of the way, let's get into the spreadsheet I have for you guys where we look at a bunch of hypothetical situations and get a real good in-depth perspective of kinetic energy loss, momentum and momentum loss, and then time to target. What I have prepared for you guys is about 5 different arrow weight setups that we're going to check out. So let's get into it. So my personal bow, I shoot the Elite Impulse 31. And if you look it up on the internet, the IBO speed of it is 343 feet per second, which is what we have input for velocity. And what we're trying to define is our kinetic energy potential that this bow has. So knowing that they test everything at 350 grains and knowing the velocity, we're able to come down and find your kinetic energy potential of that bow. So me knowing what I know about bows and kinetic energy, I know my bow at its absolute best is able to produce 91.5 foot-pounds of force when shooting. Coming down a little further, we go over the arrow specs here. So me, I shoot a 6mm arrow at 29.5 inches of length and 4 inches. Now you might say, why do I have this in the sheet? The reason why is I have to calculate my drag force. Drag force is a function of three different things. It's arrow speed, its surface area, and its density of the medium that you're going through. So you can see up top here, we have a couple calculations going on. We have surface area calculation, we have a density calculation, and then we have a speed calculation up top here. Now, what the thing that's interesting about this is as you increase your diameter, or as you increase your arrow length, or decrease it even, or fletching count, these all impact your drag force. So you'll see here, if I change my drag or my fletching count from 4 to 3, I lose a little bit of drag force, which will reduce the amount of energy loss I have in my arrow. But again, we're talking about my personal setup here, and we're just going to use this as the test values. Now, getting into the sheet here, we'll start with kinetic energy. And the thing with kinetic energy is there's an old wives' tale in the hunting community that, when you shoot an arrow at 50 yards, it's lost about 50% of its kinetic energy. And I kind of want to take a moment to address that before we go any further, because as you can see here, the real value that you're losing is roughly 11%. And we're not factoring in broadheads here. We're assuming field points. So 11% kinetic energy loss is really nothing to worry about. As you can see here, like we said before, it takes about 50 to 55 foot-pounds of force to break bone. And at 50 yards with a relatively light arrow setup, we're well into the bone-breaking force needed. It doesn't get out to 200 yards till we start questioning, hey, are we going to be able to break any ribs or scapulas that we encounter while, but nobody shoots out that far, right? For practical hunting purposes, everything we're going to talk about today is 50 yards and in. I do understand that some of you that hunt out west and are shooting maybe 60, 70 yards, that's a special case, but overall, majority of people are shooting 50 yards and in. And I would say 90% or more are shooting 30 yards in. So that's more or less what we're going to focus on today. Now, getting into kinetic energy, we talked about the loss of it and how it's relatively negligible within the 30-yard window. We're only losing 6.5%, and we're relatively close to that initial kinetic energy value. The same can be said about momentum, except for even more. So momentum here is losing even less potential energy. Momentum is going to stay relatively consistent from the time you shoot it to the time it impacts, where kinetic energy is going to vary more and more over time. The third item we have here, this is my interesting take on bow speed and the impact it has on hunting. So you'll hear everybody talk about, oh, I want to be close to 300 feet per second as I possibly can so a deer can't jump the string. And we'll get into some test values where we show a higher speed arrow and a lower speed arrow. But the purpose of this section here is what I'm evaluating as a hunter is my time to target and the potential that a deer may drop. So what we see here is that this is the time to target from the moment you release your arrow. And obviously you can read here, this is your yardages. We have two columns here. We have one here. This is assuming that a deer reacts the moment you break your shot. And then we have this one here where I factor in, a little bit of delay on the deer's end. I give them about a 50% distance reaction time. So at 10 yards, they're reacting when the arrow is about 5 yards away from them. At 20 yards, the deer is reacting. That's why you see two different values here. But the more important one to us is time to target here. So let's get into the next sheet. where we go over 5 different test values and determine kind of what they all mean. So starting with kinetic energy, as you can see here, like we proved above, the kinetic energy output of your bow stays consistent, which is why everything is relatively the same. I understand that this is a tenth less than everybody else, but again, we're talking a negligible amount of force that is different. As you scroll down here, you'll see that all your output of your kinetic energy stays relatively consistent out to 50 yards. If you really want to have a nice comparison side by side, what we're looking at here is 425 grains moving at 311 feet per second and 625 grains moving at roughly 557 feet per second. And what we're doing is we're checking out the variance between the two. And again, we're talking 50 yards in. So the variance between a light arrow and a heavy arrow is only 1.5%, or it's roughly 1 foot-pound of force that is being lost, or there's a delta of between the two. This goes back to my initial point where kinetic energy from your bow transferred into your arrow is not going to change between your arrow setup. So if you've always been on the fence about, hey, should I bump up my arrow weight because I'm going to, not have the penetration force I need, or I'm going to lose kinetic energy because my arrow's moving slower, this is proof to you that you don't have to necessarily worry about that, because regardless of your arrow weight and speed, kinetic energy is going to remain the same. Where we're going to start seeing some differences here is between the momentum and then the deer reaction time portion. So starting with momentum here, obviously the momentum initial is different between each, and as we know, momentum is a function of mass and speed. So the higher the weight, the more momentum every arrow is going to have. This is what's going to carry your arrow through the deer. Remember that. When you do a side-by-side comparison of 425 grains and 625 grains, you see that the 625 grain arrow is carrying 21 to 22% more momentum. Now, if you remember above, the kinetic energy at 30 or 50 yards was 1.5% difference. Here, this is 21 to 22. This is not a negligible amount like you saw above with kinetic energy. Now, I'm not here to preach, shoot a heavy arrow, right? I don't think you should be shooting a telephone pole going 50 feet per second. And I'm not saying you should shoot a snappy arrow, 350 grains at 350 feet per second. The purpose of this is to discuss with you guys what is a happy medium, what is a great arrow setup for you as a hunter. Me personally, last year I hunted with a 480 grain arrow, but the previous year I hunted with a 550 grain arrow. And for me personally, the way I look at it is this. I want my arrow setup to be flying about 280 feet per second all the way down to maybe 260. Why that range? It gives you enough speed that the deer can't react, but it allows for you to have an arrow weight that gives you enough oomph that when it hits a deer or hits a bone, it's not going to deflect, it's not going to stop, it's going to keep moving. So that's why I like to be somewhere around 480 grains to 550. That'll put me about the 270, 280 range for bow speed. Now, for those that are saying, hey, Chad, as we increase our arrow weight, we're going to lose speed. And that's a very good point. And I think in most instances for deer hunters, right, we're taking a shot 30 yards and in, with the ideal situation being 20 and in, right? So we're not talking about out west where you might need a flatter flight, or if a deer takes a couple of steps out west, your yardage is going to be different. You need to be able to react for that. We're talking about you're hunting from a tree stand, you're shooting at a deer that's within 30 yards, ideally at 20. And even with having a flight difference of 55 feet per second between a light arrow and a heavy arrow, here is the delta of your flight time. And the thing I want you to do here is, even at 50 yards, you're looking at a 1/10 of a second difference in arrow flight. Now, humor me for half a second, pull out your smartphone, and pull out the stopwatch function. I want you to try and start and stop your stopwatch within a 1/10 of a second. It's pretty frustrating, right? You can't do it, or a majority of people can't do it. So if you're not able to do it on your smartphone, what makes you think that at 10 yards, that 2/100ths of a second makes a huge difference? And again, we're talking about a 55 foot per second difference between a light arrow and a heavy arrow. Now, when you say, hey, Chad, 55 feet per second between 311 and 357 feet per second, that's a lot. But when you look at the numbers here, your flight time really isn't that different because of how short you're shooting. So this is just my take on bow speed and how it applies to hunting. So let's talk about main takeaways from this video. Starting with kinetic energy. Obviously, we all understand that your draw length is going to affect the amount of kinetic energy your bow is able to put out. My recommendation would be, find a local pro shop that has a way to measure bow speed, find out what your bow's potential kinetic energy is, and then play around with arrow setups that you might want to dabble with. Obviously, you know now that kinetic energy isn't going to change from your bow, so you can ideally find out what works best for you as far as speed, momentum, and kinetic energy goes. The next thing here is momentum. For those of you that were concerned about dropping kinetic energy as your bow slows down, we know that that isn't the case. So bump up that arrow, maybe 25, 50 grains, let the speed drop a little bit. We saw that the reaction time really isn't going to change from the time you shoot to the time you impact a deer within 30 yards. So that 25 to 50 grains really isn't going to make a difference. And then the final takeaway from this all is that when it comes time to shoot, shot placement is more important than the deer's reaction time. You're talking 5/100ths of a second at 25 yards, which is probably where 95% of deers are shot under. So these are things worth considering about heading into the 24 season here. So this is part 1 of 2, where we look at light arrows versus heavy arrows. Part 1 is all theoretical, where we're looking at test values and determining kind of what the actual impact is while we're hunting on paper. Part 2 is where I'm going to break my bow out, build some arrows, and go shoot at some targets at varying distances, showing you guys what flights look like, what arrow drop distances look like. So if you liked this video, you found it helpful, subscribe, and we'll get part 2 up here very shortly. Thank you, guys.